Sometimes suffering has no good reason, at least not that we can perceive of, detect, articulate. It's just suffering. It's just pain. It's just problematic. And it's hard to name. And as a friend, we come around someone suffering and we find we have no words. And when we have no words, it may be our best moment. It may be at that time we are of our greatest comfort. Well, let's continue. As we look into the life of Job, what do we see? What do we experience? What do we learn? And more important, what questions are raised? The book of Job has a prologue. It has a long body of conversation, has an epilogue. Chapters 1 and 2 introduce the story, and the conclusion comes at the end, chapter 42. And between them, we encounter conversation, poetry, drama, lament, argument, revelation. Human beings speaking with other human beings, and eventually one suffering human being speaks directly with God. The shift from the narrative framework to the poetic dialogue is very significant. Yet the prologue and epilogue remain essential because they establish the content for everything debated between chapters 3 and 42. We know something that Job's friends don't know. Job was not singled out because he was wicked. He was singled out because he was righteous. God describes him, God does it, as blameless and upright. Job, God says, is a man who fears God. He shuns evil. And that fact undermines much of what Job's friends will argue. They assume that extraordinary suffering must indicate extraordinary sin. The narrators already told us that their assumption is dead wrong. Now, I was thinking about this, sitting around under my tree, that there are at least 5 paths by which suffering enters human life. And these categories may overlap. They may not explain every instance of pain, but they can help us recognize the complexity of suffering. Number 1, sometimes we suffer because of our own wrongdoing, and this may happen through divine judgment or discipline. And throughout the history of Israel, God's discipline was often intended to bring people to repentance and restoration. It may also happen because of the consequences that are built into our choices. If I jump off a cliff, I will fall. If I become intoxicated, I may have a hangover. If I drink and drive, I may run into a tree and injure myself, or, God forbid, someone else. God does not have to suspend the laws of nature to punish every foolish choice. Sometimes the consequence is already contained within the decision. Now, number 2, sometimes we suffer because of another person's wrongdoing. The drunk driver may survive while an innocent person is injured. People suffer because someone else chose violence, oppression, neglect, betrayal, exploitation, or abuse. And so much of the suffering in this world, not just in our time, but in Bible times, is caused by people exercising their freedom at the expense of another person. The person who suffers may not be responsible for the decision that caused the suffering. We sometimes suffer because we did the right thing. That's Job's situation. It's also the experience of those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. That's a New Testament perspective. And it's Isaiah's portrayal in the suffering servant. Sometimes we make the right choice and still experience pain. Indeed, sometimes the pain comes precisely because we made the right choice. Integrity can be costly. And fourth, we sometimes suffer because we're vulnerable human beings living in a vulnerable world. A tsunami does not stop to investigate the moral character of the people in its path. Virtues will not preclude being blown away or being engulfed in a storm. Viruses and bacteria do not conduct background checks before infecting their hosts. Jesus says that God causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain upon the righteous and the unrighteous. Some experiences come simply because we are here, alive, embodied, vulnerable, sharing this world with everyone else. Fifth thing is suffering may come without any discernible reason. Job adds this disturbing possibility. God says that Job continues to maintain his integrity even though the accuser incited action against him without any reason. Well, a reason for himself, he wanted to prove God wrong, but sometimes there's no explanation available to us. Now, why would the accuser hate God and hate humanity that much? Well, I don't know. Sometimes an adversarial force is simply looking for an opportunity to accuse, to destroy, or to create trouble. I'm going to see a little better with my glasses. We want every experience to have a clean explanation, and Job doesn't allow us that luxury. So, chapter 2 takes us to another day in the heavenly court. It begins much like the scene in chapter 1. The sons of God, the angels of spiritual beings, present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser comes with them. God again asks, "Where have you been?" And the answer is essentially the same. I've been doing what I do. I've been roaming the earth. I've been patrolling. I've been investigating. God again calls attention to Job. Well, have you considered my servant Job? God repeats, Job's blameless and upright. He fears God. He shuns evil. Then God says something new. Well, he still maintains his integrity. Job has experienced compound loss. Property's gone. His servants have been killed. His children have died. His life has collapsed around it. Yet, still maintains his integrity. And the accuser responds, skin for skin. A man will give all he has for his own life. Here's a new accusation. And it becomes a philosophical question. The survival instinct will eventually overcome conviction. The accuser claims that people will preserve their principles only as long as their principles do not threaten their lives. Bring Job close enough to death. Give him enough pain. He'll abandon his integrity. He will curse God to God's face. Is it true? Sometimes it's true. Frightened people betray friends. They abandon convictions. They say whatever the interrogator wants to hear. They violate their own moral boundaries because a gun is pointed at them or because their lives have been threatened. But is it always true? Will every person surrender integrity to survive? Will Job? I mean, Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." What did he mean it? The martyr in the American Revolution said, "I regret that I have but only one life to give for my country." Well, will Job. God permits the test, but he establishes another boundary. He says, okay, he's in your hands, but you must spare his life. Now, Job doesn't know about this boundary. Only God and the accuser know that his life must be preserved. Job only knows that he's suffering in his own body. The accuser afflicts Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. And he itches and he hurts and he scrapes his skin with broken pottery. He makes it worse. And he sits among the ashes. Pain has invaded his body. And, some trials are easier to face when we have a strong support system. We might endure tremendous suffering if someone sits behind us, listens to us, reminds us we're not alone, and then another shoe drops. Job's closest support system begins to collapse because his wife asks, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." Wow. Job responds that she's speaking foolishly, and he says, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" This doesn't mean that Job feels no grief, no confusion, no anger. It doesn't mean that he understands what's happening. It means that his relationship with God is not based exclusively on receiving pleasant things from God. Job still possesses moral and spiritual agency. He retains his integrity. And the narrator concludes, in all of this, Job did not sin by what he said. And I want to make a point. I want to underline it. I want to underline it in my mind, your mind, and our hearts. Arguing with God is not abandoning God. That statement prepares us for a dialogue to come. Job will lament. He will question. He will protest. He will argue. He may shake his face toward heaven and demand an audience with God, but Job doesn't curse God. There's a difference between arguing God and abandoning God. Lament is not unbelief. Anger expressed in God's presence may itself be an evidence of a relationship that's not been surrendered. Job begins to address God because underneath all of his confusion and anguish, he still believes God is there. God will challenge and correct Job. Job's understanding is incomplete, yet the book does not portray his honest lament as the betrayal predicted by the accuser. So far, the accuser is losing. At the end, God will even distinguish Job's speech from the inadequate explanations offered by his friends. Speaking of which, I'm going to get to that. Job wrestles with God, but he doesn't walk away with God. Three friends hear about Job's suffering: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They leave their homes, they travel together to sympathize with Job and comfort him. When they see him from a distance, they barely recognize him. His suffering has changed his appearance. When they really understand, they see his conviction evokes their sorrow, and they begin to weep. They tear their robes. They sprinkle dust upon their heads. They sit on the ground with Job for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one says a word. They see how great his suffering is. How long can you sit silently with someone who's suffering? Job's friends do it for 7 days and 7 nights, a complete period of shared grief. Eventually, they decide it's time to explain things, and they begin preaching to Job, correcting Job, defending their understanding of Job. And some of what they say is true, but inappropriately applied. Some of it's distorted. Some of it must be argued out. At times, their words sound like arguments. Job may have already been conducting these arguments within himself, but they start explaining, and they do something profoundly right first before they start explaining. I want to make clear of that. They come, they weep, they mourn, they sit, they say nothing. Their silent presence is the best comfort they offer Job. There's a time for conversation. There's a time for theology. There's a time for questions, arguments, and attempts to understand. But first, there's a time to sit beside someone whose pain cannot be explained away. Sometimes friendship means resisting the urge to provide an answer. Sometimes ministry means entering the ashes and remaining there. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can say is nothing at all.